She was face down in the gravel when they found her. The rain had been coming in sideways since midnight. The iron gates of Greywood Hall were slick with it, the torchlight at the entrance post nothing but a smear of orange against the black. Thomas, the youngest groomsman, had gone out to check the post-horse's tether. His lantern caught the shape of her, a woman, lying at the foot of the gate, one cheek pressed against the wet stone, her fingers curled around something he could not identify in the dark. He shouted for Norris before he reached her. Eleanor! That was what they would call her later. In that first moment she was only a body in the gravel, with a torn dress and mud-caked hands, and a cut at her temple that had been bleeding long enough to dry, and then be washed by the rain and then begin again. She had not given her name. She had not given anything. She was unconscious before Thomas's lantern reached her face. Norris arrived at the gate in his nightcoat and stood looking at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he told Thomas to take her feet. They laid her on the settle in the housekeeper's anteroom and stood looking at her. There were 5 of them by then: Norris, Thomas, Mrs. Holt the housekeeper, and 2 kitchen maids who had heard the shouting and come down in their caps. "She is nobody I know," one of the kitchen maids said. "She is somebody's problem," said the other. Mrs. Holt came closer and crouched beside the settle. She peeled back one of the woman's hands from the object she was clutching, just enough to see the chain, and then let the hand close again. The woman's fingers tightened even unconscious. Mrs. Holt noted the torn dress, the road-worn boots with the sole separating at the left heel, the dried blood at the temple, the careful nails, the smooth skin of the hands underneath the mud. She noted all of it without comment. "Parish will take her," said one of the footmen from the doorway. He had not been invited in, but had arrived nonetheless. "We don't know her." "The parish is 3 miles in this rain," Mrs. Holt said, and she did not raise her voice. "Bring me a warm cloth and the liniment from the second shelf, and send Finch to wake his grace." The footman started to say something about the hour. "Now," said Mrs. Holt. He went. Eleanor lay on the settle with rain still dripping from her hair onto the floor, and her hand closed around the pendant, and not one person in that room knew who she was. She was worth nothing to any of them. She was a woman found in the gravel with no name and no explanation, and a chain around her fist that caught the candlelight and glittered green. That was the sum of it. That was all she was. Dominic Ashworth, Duke of Windermere, came down the stairs in his shirt-sleeves with his cravat absent, and his expression suggesting that whatever had pulled him from sleep had better be worth it. He stopped in the doorway. The room did what rooms always did when he entered them, which was to go quiet. Norris straightened. Mrs. Holt, who straightened for nobody, stood up from beside the settle and turned to face him with her hands clasped. Dominic did not look at Norris. He did not look at Mrs. Holt. He looked at the woman on the settle. Dominic Ashworth was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with grey eyes that gave nothing away, and a stillness that could read as control or as a threat, depending on which side of it you stood. He crossed the room and crouched where Mrs. Holt had crouched, and he looked at Eleanor the way he looked at dispatches that contained bad news, completely without expression, taking in all of it before deciding anything. He noticed the pendant. He reached out and lifted the chain from her fist. She was deeply unconscious and did not stir, and held it toward the nearest candle. The pendant caught the light, an emerald, oval set in gold, on a fine chain. Old work. The setting had the quality of something made deliberately rather than decoratively. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he looked at her borrowed dress, her road-worn boots, her split lip where she had bitten through it at some point during whatever had brought her here. The pendant did not match the dress. He laid the chain back in her palm and stood up. "Has she spoken?" he asked. "She has not woken," Norris said. "Send for Dr. Randall." He paused. "Not Crosby. Randall." Norris noted the distinction without comment. Dr. Randall arrived at 2:30 in the morning, examined Eleanor by candlelight, cleaned the wound at her temple, determined nothing was broken, and said that her body would do the work now and that he would return in the morning. The fever was a near thing, he thought. The dehydration was a near thing. She had been on the road for longer than was good for her, and had pushed past the point where any reasonable person would have stopped. Dominic stood at the doorway and watched the physician work. He did not go in. He stayed at the threshold the way he always stayed at thresholds, contained, observant, registering everything at a distance he chose. When Randall was done and had gathered his case, Dominic said, "Send for Fellows in the morning as well. I want a second view." Randall looked at him. "She is a young woman with a head wound and a fever. She will be fine." "In the morning," Dominic said. "Fellows." Randall went. Dominic stood at the doorway of the housekeeper's anteroom looking at the woman on the settle for one moment longer. Her hand was closed around the pendant again. The chain was looped 3 times round her fist, the pendant itself pressed into her palm, and she had been holding it like that long enough that the imprint of the setting was visible in her skin. She had been holding it for hours. No one in this house could answer what she was running from, or what she had been carrying through his gates at midnight in a rainstorm. He turned and went back up the stairs. But he sent for a second physician. She woke to the sound of rain that had stopped. The room was small and whitewashed, with a window that let in more grey than light. For a long, disoriented moment, Eleanor lay still and took stock of what she knew. The ceiling was not the ceiling of anywhere she had been before. The pillow was linen, not wool. She was warm. Her head hurt in a specific way that told her she had been running a fever and was coming out the other side of it. Her hand was empty. She sat up too quickly and had to grip the mattress edge while the room found its position. The pendant was on the bedside table, placed there deliberately. She could see the chain carefully folded alongside it. Someone had removed it from her fist while she slept. The pendant was intact. She breathed. Mrs. Holt came in with a tray. Eleanor told her what she safely could. Fenwick, she said, a village in the north. She had been a governess's charge there for most of her memory. There had been a fire. The village, the cottage, the records, all of it. Martha, she said. Her name had been Martha, had not come out. Eleanor had waited in the road until morning to be certain, and then she had walked south. She did not mention the pendant. She did not know how long she had been walking. Several days. More than a week, she thought, but the fever had taken the middle portion of the journey and left it blurred. "Do you have family?" Mrs. Holt asked. "No," Eleanor said. "Not that I know of." This was true. It was also the most painful thing she had said aloud in several days, and she said it without flinching because she had been saying it to herself for a week and had run out of the energy required to react to it. Mrs. Holt set the tray down and looked at her with the expression of a woman who had managed other people's difficulties for 30 years and had developed an efficient sympathy for them. "You will rest today," she said, "and tomorrow. His Grace has been informed." Eleanor looked at her. "You are at Greywood Hall," Mrs. Holt said, "in Windermere, the Duke's household." Eleanor absorbed this. She held the pendant in both hands and looked at it. She had always had it. Her earliest memory was of her governess Martha holding it up to the light and saying, "Not yet, little one." Martha had not come out of the fire. Eleanor set the pendant carefully on the bedside table and picked up the spoon. She was up and walking on the 3rd day, allowed the run of the ground floor at Mrs. Holt's discretion. She found the library within the hour, which was how she always found libraries. The estate farm accounts were on the reading table, apparently left there by the steward who had been using them and then been called elsewhere. Eleanor glanced at the cover, glanced away, glanced back. She sat down. The accounts were for the Greywood Hall home farm. 5 years of records organised by quarter, with columns for seed cost, labour, yield per acre, drainage expenditure, and comparative yield change. She turned to the current year, then the previous year, then 2 years prior. She was not reading casually. She was reading the way someone had taught her, once, in a place that did not exist anymore in any form she could prove. The numbers in the drainage expenditure column for the East Field had been rising steadily for 4 years. The yield change for the same field had been flat, then declining. That combination was not possible if the money was being spent where the column said it was being spent. She found the specific entry. It was dated. It was specific. It had a name attached. She marked the page with a strip of ribbon from the desk drawer and set the book aside, exactly as she had found it. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she put the ribbon in her pocket and went to find Mrs. Holt, because she needed to know where she could walk outdoors. She did not mention the accounts to anyone, but she did not stop thinking about them. Lady Eugenia Pemberton arrived at Greywood Hall on a Tuesday, in a carriage that had clearly been driven hard. The horses were steaming, and her companion was pink-faced and hurrying. Lady Eugenia herself descended as though she had all the time in the world and had never once been persuaded otherwise. She was 71. She wore violet. She carried a silver-handled walking stick she did not appear to require. She entered the drawing-room, sat down without being invited to, and looked at Eleanor for the better part of a minute with the same complete attention Dominic had used at the doorway, but warmer and considerably more inconvenient. "Well," she said, "you are not from the Americas." Eleanor opened her mouth. "Your vowels," Lady Eugenia said without unkindness. "The Americas produce a perfectly identifiable accent. Yours is not it. However," she raised one hand briefly, "that is not a problem. It is a detail. Details are manageable." Norris arrived with the tea tray. Lady Eugenia accepted a cup without looking at him, and turned to Dominic, who had been standing by the window with the expression of a man who had arranged this meeting and was already regretting it. "The season," she said. "She will debut in 6 weeks. I will manage the story. She's a distant relation. The English do not study American accents with sufficient rigour to distinguish them from a colonial upbringing in one of the Eastern Territories. We will say Connecticut. They have no idea what Connecticut sounds like." She paused. "Neither, as it happens, does anyone else. It is ideal." Dominic said nothing. He was watching Eleanor. "You will be Miss Eleanor Vane," Lady Eugenia told Eleanor. "I will provide the surname. The backstory involves a grandfather who emigrated before the wars. You will not need to remember much of it, because most people will not ask. They will simply repeat it to each other and let it grow." She sipped her tea. "That is what society does with narratives it finds convenient." Eleanor looked at her. "And if I wish to leave?" Lady Eugenia set down her cup with a small, precise click. "Where would you go?" This was not cruel. It was simply accurate. Eleanor had no papers. She had no name she could prove. She had a pendant she could not explain, and a village that was ash. The season in London as Miss Eleanor Vane was not a gift. It was the only exit she had. Lady Eugenia knew it. Eleanor knew it. Neither of them said so out loud. "The season begins in 6 weeks, Lady Eugenia said. "We had better start now." It was Norris who brought the letter to Dominic's attention, placing it on the desk with the particular quality of placement that meant the butler had read it, or at least read enough of it to form a view about its significance. Dominic picked it up. It was addressed to him directly, on paper of good quality, sealed with a crest he did not immediately recognize. He broke the seal and read it. Lord Edmund Hartwell, the Earl of Hartwell, wrote to inquire whether anyone at Greywood Hall had knowledge of the whereabouts of a young woman answering the following description: approximately 20 years of age, fair complexion, green eyes, fair hair, last seen in the vicinity of Fenwick in the north. Miss Hartwell, the letter called her that, Miss Hartwell, was a ward of Lord Hartwell's late sister's household, and had been missing since a fire in the village some weeks past. Any information would be received with gratitude. There was a postscript. It had been added in a different hand, tighter and more deliberate than the body of the letter. A distinguishing feature, the young woman in question carried, and would not willingly part with, an emerald pendant on a gold chain, of some family significance. Dominic read the postscript twice. He looked toward the corridor without moving from his chair. He could hear, faintly, the sound of Eleanor reading aloud to Mrs. Holt's youngest in the kitchen passage. She had taken to doing that in the evenings, apparently, and no one had told her to stop. He looked at the letter again. He looked at the underlined phrase, the emerald pendant. "File this," he said to Norris. Norris took it. His expression said nothing. He had been in service to this household for 22 years, and had the face to show for it. Dominic did not send an answer to Lord Edmund Hartwell. Not yet. The house party arrived in stages over the following 2 days. Carriages, boxes, hat cases, and opinions. Lady Eugenia had issued the invitations and had her reasons for each of them, most of which she did not share. Lady Arabella Fairfax arrived on Wednesday. Eleanor knew her the moment she stepped from the carriage, not because she had met her, because she understood watching Lady Arabella look at the house, and then look at the assembled household, and then look at Eleanor, exactly how quickly Lady Arabella had sorted the room and what conclusion she had reached. Lady Arabella was beautiful. She was also composed and clever, and had been arranging herself in the centre of social situations since she could walk. She wore blue. She wore it perfectly. She spoke to Lady Eugenia first. She spoke to Dominic second. She spoke to no one in between. 20 minutes later, she walked through the drawing room with two other guests, daughters of an earl introduced to Eleanor as Miss Sinclair and her cousin, and Eleanor was standing at the window when Lady Arabella stopped 3 feet from her and said, addressing Lady Eugenia, who was across the room, "Lady Eugenia, is your American acquaintance staying long? Only I noticed the dress is borrowed." A small pause. "Mrs. Holt's daughter, I believe. I recognise the sleeve treatment." The two Miss Sinclairs looked at Eleanor's dress. Eleanor looked at Lady Arabella. Lady Arabella was not looking at Eleanor. She was looking at Lady Eugenia, who had not moved, and whose expression held no more reaction than if she had been told the weather. "She arrived without luggage," Lady Arabella continued pleasantly. "One naturally wonders about the education when there is no luggage. Where was it that you studied, Miss? Forgive me, I don't believe I caught the name." Eleanor said her name. She said it clearly and without apology. Lady Arabella smiled. It was a complete smile, warm and appropriate. "How charming," she said. "That accent." And she moved on. The two Miss Sinclairs moved with her. Cecily Davenport, who had been standing near the fireplace for the entire exchange and had watched Lady Arabella leave, crossed the room to Eleanor and said, "I am Cecily Davenport, and I find the sleeve treatment on that dress perfectly respectable. And would you like to walk in the garden before dinner? I am told the roses are still going." Eleanor looked at her. Cecily had a round, warm face and dark eyes that were currently bright with something that was not quite indignation, but was a close neighbour to it. "Yes," Eleanor said, "I would." They walked in the garden. It helped. That evening Norris, moving through the drawing room with the tea tray at precisely the moment Eleanor passed Lady Arabella's orbit again, managed by some architectural miracle to place himself between them as naturally as if he had been standing there all along. He said nothing. He offered Eleanor a cup with the same imperturbable formality he offered everyone. Lady Arabella's next observation went unwitnessed. Eleanor accepted the tea. She did not feel safe, but she felt less alone. And for the moment, that would have to be sufficient. Norris delivered the summons with the tone of someone delivering a perfectly ordinary instruction, which meant it was anything but. Eleanor followed him down the corridor and into the study, which was large enough that a man could arrange himself behind a desk and have considerable ground between himself and whoever stood opposite. Dominic had arranged himself accordingly. He was seated. She stood. The desk occupied the middle distance like a statement of intent. Eleanor had dressed carefully that morning, which meant she had done what she could with the borrowed dress and the hairpins Mrs. Holt had lent her, and the single intact ribbon in the case that had come from somewhere. She met Dominic's gaze and held it, because it was the one thing she could control in this room, and she intended to control it. He looked at her in the same way he had looked at the dispatch on his desk before she arrived, completely, registering everything, giving nothing back. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Mrs. Holt has relayed the facts you gave her," he said. "Fenwick, the fire, no surviving family, no papers." "That is correct," Eleanor said. "Then you are in a particular position." He said this without expression, which made it worse and also more honest than if he had softened it. "You cannot leave this county without documentation. You cannot establish yourself anywhere without a name that can be verified. You have neither." Eleanor said nothing. This was also accurate, and she had no counter-argument to make against accuracy. "Lady Eugenia has proposed a course of action," Dominic said. "You will be presented to London society as Miss Eleanor Vane, a distant connection of mine from the eastern territories of North America. Lady Eugenia will sponsor your debut. You will receive a sufficient wardrobe and an allowance adequate to the role. You will maintain the cover story without deviation, and you will conduct yourself as Lady Eugenia directs." He paused. "I should tell you," he said, "that I am already contractually committed. There is a betrothal to a noblewoman named Lady Marian Ashford, a missing woman, the daughter of the late Earl of Ashford. The contract predates the current situation considerably. I mention it because it means the cover story cannot involve any romantic attachment to me. The Tun will receive you as a relation, not as a candidate. Lady Eugenia understands this and has accounted for it in her plan." Eleanor received this information. She noted the name, Lady Marian Ashford. She noted the word missing. She filed both and returned to the practical matter at hand. "And if I decline?" she asked. "You would remain at Greywood Hall as a guest without documentation, without a way forward, and without the season's social protection," he said. "Lady Eugenia's plan is the only exit from your current position that does not require something I cannot provide." There was a long moment. "I accept," Eleanor said. He nodded once, as if this were the only sensible conclusion, which from his perspective it clearly was. He stood to indicate the meeting was concluded. Eleanor stood. She rose too quickly. The fever had been gone for 4 days, but the weakness was slower to follow, and when she stood the room swam sideways for a moment, and her hand went to the back of the chair. He was at her side before she registered that he had moved. One hand, steady at her elbow, not a grip, a steadying. A grip controls. This simply held what was already there. She felt the warmth of it. She found her footing. He released her immediately. He stepped back. He turned away and picked up the dispatch he had set aside when she entered, and he did not look at her, and he did not say anything about it, and he moved to the window as though the gesture had not happened. Eleanor stood for a moment in the space where his hand had been. Lady Eugenia was in the doorway behind her, having appeared without announcement, as was apparently her right. Her expression was the expression of a woman who had just seen something she expected to see and was not going to say so. "The dowry," Lady Eugenia said to Eleanor, gesturing for her to come through to the corridor, "is £15,000 in trust in your name. Dominic has arranged it." She walked without the stick when she chose to, apparently. "Your social existence was constructed by the Duke of Windermere. That will be its own protection in society." Eleanor thought about this as they walked. £15,000, a trust in her name. He had done this before she agreed to anything. She was not certain how she felt about that. "The pendant," Lady Eugenia said. They had reached the blue bedroom, which was on the second floor with windows facing east. The morning light, as Mrs. Holt had said, was very good. Nell, a quiet girl with light brown hair, was already present, folding things with practised efficiency. "You must remove it for the season," Lady Eugenia said. "The Ashford emerald is distinctive. Anyone who knew the Ashford family before the trouble would recognise it. You will wear borrowed pieces or new purchases until the question of your identity is settled. The pendant will be kept here, in your room, safe." Eleanor stopped walking. "The Ashford emerald," she said. "That is what it is," Lady Eugenia said. Not unkindly, but she offered nothing more, which told Eleanor that she knew more and had decided how much of it to share. Eleanor looked at the pendant for a long time. It was still warm from her skin. She set it on the dressing table herself. She placed it there, which was different from having it taken. She set it down gently with the chain curled around it, and she stepped back and looked at it. Then she turned to Nell, who was waiting with an expression of patient practicality. "Right," Eleanor said. "What are we starting with?" Norris brought her the key to the room himself, at 8 in the evening, with the formality of someone performing a deliberate ceremony. There was nothing ceremonial in his manner. There never was. But the key was on a small silver ring, and he placed it in her hand and said, "The household takes breakfast at 8 and luncheon at 1. If you require anything in the night, Mrs. Holt's room is at the end of the south passage." Eleanor took the key. "Thank you," she said. "Of course, Miss Vane," he said, and went. Eleanor looked at the key in her palm for a moment. Then she went inside and closed the door behind her. The latch settled with a small, quiet sound, the sound of a particular life beginning, whether she was ready for it or not. The blue bedroom had a fireplace and morning windows and a dressing table where a pendant sat on a chain. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the pendant across the room in the firelight. A woman she had never met had apparently worn it in a portrait. Lord Edmund Hartwell had known about it specifically enough to name it in a letter to a duke. She did not know what either of those things meant. But for the first time since Fenwick burned, she had a room with a key, and a fire, and morning light to look forward to, and those were not nothing. The pendant caught the firelight and held it. She was no one for now, but she had somewhere to be. Lady Eugenia's lessons were conducted with the brisk confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome and was simply arranging the facts to match. "You will enter a room as though you intended to be there," Lady Eugenia said. "Not as though you are hoping to be permitted. There is a material difference, and every person in that room will feel it before you say a word." Eleanor entered the ballroom doorway for the third time that morning. "Better," Lady Eugenia said. "Now, the waltz. Take the chair." Cecily, who had attached herself to the lessons on the grounds that she needed the practice herself, was currently the chair's stand-in for the purpose of Eleanor learning the correct arm position. She was also laughing, which Lady Eugenia did not forbid but did not encourage. "If you laugh at the wrong moment at Almack's," Lady Eugenia told Cecily, "you will be forgiven, because you are charming, and your father is a viscount, and the committee finds you amusing. If Miss Vane laughs at the wrong moment, she will be the American girl who laughed when she should not have. This is not equitable. It is true." Cecily stopped laughing and practiced her arm position with more attention. Eleanor had the knack of the waltz by the second morning, which was not surprising because she had the knack of almost everything physical. She absorbed instruction quietly and then executed it with a precision that was not showy and was not discussed. Lady Eugenia noticed. She did not say anything about it. She moved to the next lesson. Fan language, the art of the exit, how to decline a dance without giving offence, how to receive a cut direct and make the person who delivered it feel they had done something graceless. "That last one," Lady Eugenia said, "is an art form, and you already have the face for it. We simply need to be certain you know when to use it." It was during the third week, when the season was close enough to feel, that Dominic told Eleanor she might call him Dominic when they were at Greywood Hall, and there were no guests to observe. He said it during the riding lesson, which he had been conducting in the back paddock, with the practicality of someone managing a travel requirement. The mare's name was Iris. She was gentle and broad-backed and had the temperament of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. Eleanor repeated his name once to verify she had heard correctly. "And you may give me yours in return," he said, "for when the situation requires it." "Eleanor," she said. She hesitated 1 second too long, just perceptibly, because she was giving him the only name she had, and part of her understood even then that it was borrowed. "Eleanor." He nodded and rode ahead. Neither of them called it an intimacy, which it was. Cecily, watching from the fence with Lady Eugenia, said something that made Lady Eugenia produce a small, precise sound that was not quite a laugh. "I have seen that horse better ridden," Lady Eugenia said, watching Dominic's retreating figure with an expression of serene observation. "But I suspect it is not the horse he is thinking about." Cecily turned to look at her. Lady Eugenia sipped her tea. The farm visit was not planned to be a shared occasion. Eleanor had gone with Lady Eugenia to call on Mrs. Weston at the tenant farm as part of what Lady Eugenia called understanding the landscape of the household's obligations. Dominic appeared unexpectedly with estate business for Weston himself, and the result was that 4 people spent the better part of an afternoon in Weston's parlour, discussing the Eastfields drainage, the upcoming harvest, and whether the new stovepipe needed replacing before winter. Mrs. Weston had no interest in dancing around the obvious. Mrs. Weston had opinions and expressed them. "It is good that you come together," she told them, over a very decisive tea, looking from Dominic to Eleanor. "Weston and I manage better when we come together. 22 years, and I still cannot read a yield table, and he still cannot cook a Sunday joint, but we come together, and it all sorts itself." "We are not together," Eleanor said pleasantly. "In the sense you mean." "No?" Mrs. Weston looked at Dominic. Dominic said nothing. He had the particular quality of stillness in moments like this that could mean anything. "He is my guardian," Eleanor said. "Temporarily. It is a practical arrangement." "Practical," Mrs. Weston repeated, with the tone of a woman who had been alive long enough to know what practical arrangements turned into. Eleanor took a decisive sip of tea and did not look at Dominic. Dominic, across the table, appeared to be examining his cup with unusual care. The rain caught them on the way back. They sheltered under the stable eave at Greywood Hall while Lady Eugenia made it to the house ahead of them, and Cecily ran for the side entrance. The rain was the sort that came sideways and covered the 20 yards to the door completely. They stood under the eave, not quite touching, close enough that the cold air was less cold. Eleanor said after a moment, "Practical arrangement." She had not meant to say it aloud. It was the kind of thing her interior voice said and usually stayed there. Dominic turned to look at her. "Mrs. Weston was—" Eleanor began. He almost laughed. It was not a full laugh. It was the arrest of a laugh, the thing that happens when a laugh rises without permission and is caught just before it escapes. And it changed his face for a full second before he caught it. The control came back immediately. He looked away. But Eleanor had seen it, and they both knew she had seen it, and neither of them said anything about it. Guilford arrived through the side gate with a letter, which he handed to Dominic without ceremony. Dominic took it and read it. The distance came back. The cold returned. "You should go in," he said. "You will want to dress for dinner." Eleanor went in. She did not say anything about the almost laugh to anyone, but she thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. She brought him the marked page without preamble. She had been thinking about how to do this for a week, and she had decided that the only way to do it without being dismissed was to simply present the information and let him make of it what he would. So she knocked on the study door at a time she knew he was working on accounts, and she went in, and she set the estate ledger on the desk in front of him, open to the marked page, and she said, "The East Field." He looked at the page. He looked at her. "The drainage expenditure column," she said. 4 years of entries. The figures rise by roughly 15% each year. The reported yield for the same field over the same period is flat, then declining in the 3rd year. Those two figures are not compatible if the drainage work is actually being done. He said nothing yet. He was looking at the page. "The entry from 2 quarters ago," she continued, "is dated a week before the dry spell in July. There was no drainage work done during the dry spell. Weston mentioned it himself, when he said the summer had been good for the East Field without any of the usual standing water. If the drainage work was done the week before, the standing water should have been worse, not better, unless the work that was billed was not done at all." Dominic turned the page back 1 year. "The signature on the July entry," Eleanor said. "It is not Weston's mark." He picked up the page and held it toward the window. The signature on the July entry was small and deliberate, and belonged to no one she could identify, but she had checked it against 3 other entries signed by Weston himself, and they did not match. Dominic said, "Who else has seen this?" "No one." "When did you notice it?" "When I first found the ledger in the library," she said. 3 weeks ago." He set it down. He looked at her, the same focused attention she had seen at the stable eve, but this time directed at the information she had brought him, not at her face. She found that easier to bear. "Tell Norris to speak with Weston about the East Field change," he said. "Tell him it comes from the estate review, not from you." "All right," she said. "Thank you, Miss Vane," he said. And then, because he was not entirely the cold thing he presented, he said, "Eleanor, thank you." She went back to the lesson room. 2 weeks later, Weston reported that the East Field had outperformed its 5-year average after the correction. Dominic told no one where the suggestion had originated. He did not need to. Eleanor knew, and that was sufficient. The journalist was at the dining table. Eleanor did not know immediately that he was a journalist. She had been introduced to him as a Mr. Fitch, an acquaintance of the Hartwell connection, and she had received this information and filed it in the category of things to be watchful about, which was where she filed most things these days. Mr. Fitch had the particular quality of attention that journalists develop, the appearance of being interested in everything except the specific thing he was directing the conversation toward. He worked his way around the table through the fish course with broad social interest, and by the time the joint arrived, he had settled on Eleanor. "Miss Vane," he said, "Lady Eugenia tells me your family were among the earlier settlers in Connecticut. When did they arrive exactly? The Vane family, I mean." Eleanor gave him the answer Lady Eugenia had provided, and he wrote nothing down, which was not reassuring. "And your parents are both gone now," he said, with sympathy. "Yes," Eleanor said, "leaving you in England with no direct family." He said this pleasantly, as though summarizing for clarity. "And what was your mother's name before her marriage? The maiden name?" Eleanor looked at him. Across the table, Lady Arabella was looking at her food with the expression of someone who had arranged a room and was waiting to see what happened in it. "Wycliffe," Eleanor said, which was the name Lady Eugenia had given her for exactly this possibility. "Wycliffe," Mr. Fitch said. "And they were from which county originally?" "Mr. Fitch," Dominic had spoken. He had done it without raising his voice, which made it more effective. He addressed the table generally, tilting his remarks toward Mr. Fitch with the specific gravity of a man who had decided what he wanted the table to discuss. "I understand you have an opinion on the new customs agreement with the Portuguese traders. I had a letter from Lord Mansfield about it this week and found myself uncertain on the third point. I wonder if you have a view." Mr. Fitch had no choice. He had a view. He expressed it. Eleanor spent the rest of the dinner discussing the customs agreement. She watched Lady Arabella across the table. Lady Arabella watched Dominic. After dinner, in the corridor, while the guests gathered for cards, Dominic passed close enough to Eleanor to say, quietly, without turning his head, "You should not attend social engagements outside of Lady Eugenia's specific arrangements without her present, for your own security." It was not warm. It was functional. It carried the implication that she was an asset to be managed, and she felt it that way even though she understood why he had said it. "Of course," she said. He moved on. Both of them knew he had done something for her in that dining room. Both of them knew he had then reminded her that it was not personal. Eleanor filed this in the same place she was filing everything else, the place where she kept the things she would think about later, when she had the room to herself and the fire going and the pendant on the dressing table catching the light. She had taken to walking the house at night when she could not sleep, which was more often than she would have preferred. The east corridor was on the way to nothing except the family portraits and the door to the south wing, which was always locked. She had tried it once, idly, and found it locked. Norris had appeared from nowhere to mention that the south wing was not in current use. He said this without accusation and without explanation, in the tone of something that was simply a fact. She had not tried again. Tonight she came around the corner of the east corridor and stopped. Dominic was standing at the portrait. He was standing very still, and one hand was near the frame, not touching it, just near it, the way a hand is when it has been there many times before and no longer needs to think about where to go. He had not heard her. She had not made any sound. The lamp on the side table caught the frame's gilt and his dark hair and left his face in partial shadow. Eleanor stood at the corner and watched him for longer than was polite. She had not seen this before. He was not doing anything. He was just standing there. She looked at the portrait. The man in it was perhaps 40 years old, painted before the fashion for formal poses had shifted, and he looked kind. He had his son's jaw and his son's shoulders, and none of his son's stillness. The man in the portrait looked as though he had been smiling a moment before the painter arranged him. He looked nothing like how Dominic looked now. Dominic turned. He saw her. He took his hand from the frame's vicinity. He straightened slightly. "Miss Vane," he said. Not, "What are you doing here?" Not, "Go back to your room." Just the two words which meant, "I know you saw this, and I know, and we will not discuss it." He walked past her and into the further dark of the corridor, and was gone. Eleanor looked at the portrait for another moment. Then she looked at the door to the south wing at the far end of the corridor, which was closed and locked and had been for as long as she had been in this house. She turned and went back to her room. She did not say this to anyone, but something had settled in her chest that was not quite sympathy and not quite grief, close enough to both that she understood she was in trouble. For the first time since Fenwick, she realized she had something to lose. London was exactly what Lady Eugenia had promised, and nothing she had prepared Eleanor for. The sound alone, the smell of the river and the horses and the coal smoke all arriving together through any window left open, the carriages in the street at 7 in the morning, the calls of the vendors below, a density of people moving in every direction on business that had nothing to do with her. She stood at the Ashworth House window on her first morning and understood, for the first time, that being nobody in London was easier than being nobody in a country house, because in London nobody looked. She had been introduced to society as Miss Eleanor Vane 3 weeks ago at a private gathering Lady Eugenia had selected as a warm entry. She had then been introduced at 2 assemblies and 1 very large dinner. She had danced. She had been presented to people she would remember, and people she would forget, and people who were clearly trying to place her and had given up. Captain Fellows had danced with her twice, and said nothing of consequence, and looked at her in a way that meant something, but she had no energy for it. She was doing well, which was its own kind of exhaustion. It was a Thursday in May when the package arrived. Norris brought it to the library where Dominic was working, and Eleanor was also present, having been given the run of it on the grounds that the alternative was sitting in her room doing nothing. The package was small. It was addressed to Dominic. The seal was the Hartwell crest. Dominic opened it without ceremony. Inside was a miniature portrait, the size of a palm. A child, perhaps 7 years old, blonde, with green eyes and a fine-boned face. There was a letter inside as well, from Lord Edmund Hartwell, which Dominic read in silence and then set on the desk without sharing its contents. He looked at the portrait for a long time. Then he picked up the pendant from his desk drawer. Eleanor had returned it to him a week ago for a jeweller's examination. He looked from the portrait to Eleanor. He looked for a long time. Eleanor watched his face. She saw the moment something shifted in it. "I need you to accompany me to Bond Street," he said. Philip Randall was the kind of craftsman who handled expensive things so routinely that he had stopped being impressed by them, which made him useful for purposes like this one. He took the pendant from Dominic without ceremony, turned it over in his hands, produced a glass, and examined the setting for several minutes while Dominic and Eleanor stood on opposite sides of his workbench and said nothing to each other. "There is something inside the setting," Randall said at last. "The casing is heavier than the stone warrants, about 1/3 of an ounce too heavy for the size. The setting has been modified at some point. The original work is older than the modification. The modification is skilled, but it is there." He set down his glass and looked at Dominic. "You want me to open it? Can you do it without damaging it?" "Yes." It took 10 minutes. When Randall set the pendant on the bench and indicated the result, Eleanor stepped forward to look. There was a small compartment behind the lower edge of the setting. It was barely large enough. Inside was a key, bronze, small, the kind used for a document box or a personal strongbox rather than a door. Randall lifted it out with a tool and set it on the glass surface. Dominic picked it up. He held it to the light. The initials were engraved on the bow of the key. 3 letters, H-A-W. He went completely still. Eleanor watched him. She had not seen him go that still before, not even in the East Corridor. This was different. This was the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting 15 years for a confirmation he stopped believing would come. "Henry Ashworth Windermere," he said. His voice was level, and it cost him something to keep it level. "My father's initials." He set the key down on the glass surface next to the pendant. He spread them apart with one finger. He looked at the miniature portrait of the blonde 7-year-old, which he had brought with him in his coat pocket. He set it beside the key. Then he looked at Eleanor. The comparison was not subtle. The bone structure in the miniature, the green eyes, the fair hair, the particular set of the jaw. "You are Lady Marian Ashford," he said. It was not a question. Eleanor looked at the miniature. She looked at the pendant. She looked at the key with 3 initials she did not recognize, but that had apparently been inside the only thing she had carried from her childhood for her entire conscious life. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Marian." She said it the way you say a word in a language you have never spoken before, careful, checking the shape of it, uncertain whether it belongs to you. "Marian Ashford," she said. "That is my name." "Your father was Oscar Ashford," Dominic said, "the 14th Earl of Ashford. He and my father were in school together. They were close for 30 years. They were killed in the same carriage accident. I was told you were dead." "I was told to disappear," Eleanor said. There was a silence that had 15 years in it. "My father died in the autumn of 1807, Dominic said. "I was 17. The carriage accident happened on the London road. The official ruling was road accident. I have never believed that." Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the key in his hand with his father's initials. She thought about Martha and the pendant, and not yet, little one. "He knew," she said. "My father. He knew something was coming. That was why he put the key in the pendant." "Whatever the key opens," Dominic said, "is in my study at Greywood Hall." "The south wing," Eleanor said. He looked at her sharply. "The locked door," she said. "You have been carrying something for 15 years. Whatever it opens is in that locked room." He did not deny it. Captain Fellows came to Ashworth House that afternoon. He was shown to the small sitting room. He was sincere and careful, and he looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who had been thinking about something for several weeks and had decided to say it. He proposed. Eleanor listened to him entirely. She did not interrupt. He was kind. He was respectable. He had nothing to do with any of this. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I am very grateful," she said. for everything you have, for the regard you have shown me. You are a good man, Captain Fellows." She left the room without answering. That evening she went to the library and found the chessboard. She had always liked chess. It required the same kind of attention as ledgers, the patience to track many moving parts at once, the discipline not to move until the position was clear. She set up the board and played both sides for a while, thinking. Dominic came in at 9 o'clock. He saw the board. He sat down. They played without discussion. He was better than she was, and chose not to show it completely, which she noticed and filed away. The library was quiet. The house had settled into its evening routine. Outside, London went on being London. The game lasted 2 hours. It ended in a draw, which required both of them to be playing at their best. Dominic extended his hand at the end of the game. Eleanor extended hers. They shook, and neither released immediately. The handshake lasted 1 second past what it was, and then another, and Dominic's gaze moved from the board to her face, and she looked up, and he kissed her. It was brief, unplanned. The warmth of it lasted longer than it had any right to. Then Norris opened the library door, saw what he saw, and managed his expression with the precision of 22 years of practice. He said something about whether the fire needed banking. He received an answer. He left. Eleanor stood. "Whatever is between us legally," she said, "I am not property of the contract. You had a document that obligated me before I was old enough to know what it said. A betrothal is a document. A choice is something else." She was not rejecting him. She was making a distinction that mattered enormously, and she needed him to hear it. He looked at her. "I understand," he said. She went to the door. She stopped. "You should open the south wing," she said. "Whatever is in that room, it is not more dangerous than what you have been carrying alone." She went upstairs. Eleanor arrived at Hartwell House the following morning against Dominic's explicit instruction. She had considered his instruction carefully, and determined that she had to go. Lord Edmund Hartwell was at the door when she arrived, as though he had been expecting her. He might have been. He greeted her with the kind of smoothness that is not warmth, and she noted every layer of the difference. Lady Constance Hartwell was in the drawing-room. She was the kind of woman who expressed hostility through the absence of warmth. She offered the correct words at the correct moments, and not one degree of feeling above what social obligation required. "Miss Vane," she said, "what a pleasant surprise." It was not a pleasant surprise. Arthur Hartwell appeared in the doorway behind his mother. He was perhaps 12, with his father's colouring, and the face of someone who had been anxious for a long time, and had learned to wear it as aggression. "How long are you staying?" he asked. Not a greeting, a challenge. "Long enough to be useful," Eleanor said, which was the only honest answer she had. She was given a room on the second floor. She unpacked the small case she had brought herself, packed without Nell or Lady Eugenia, packed carefully. She opened the armoire and found it locked. She found the key in the drawer. She opened it. There was a false panel at the back of the armoire. She found it because she was looking, because she was the kind of person who looked at things until she understood them. Behind the false panel was a portrait, covered in cloth. She uncovered it. 2 people, painted the year before their deaths, from the quality of the brushwork and the fashion of the dress. A man of perhaps 40, fair-haired, with the careful expression of someone who trusted painters about as much as he trusted anyone. A woman beside him, younger, with fair hair and green eyes, and the particular look of someone who was happy in this moment, and knew that moments like this should be remembered. She was wearing a pendant at her throat, an emerald, oval set in gold. Eleanor put her hand to her own throat where the pendant was, and stood there. "Marian Ashford," she said quietly, to the woman in the portrait. "That is your name." It was hers as well. She stood in front of her parents' portrait for a long time. When she finally turned away and replaced the cloth and closed the panel, she sat on the edge of the bed. She was in this house. The man who owned it had been stealing from her father's estate for 15 years while she had no name to claim. She was sitting inside the theft. 3 doors away, in a locked study she had already found the location of, were ledgers. She was going to read them. In the empty rooms of Ashworth House, Dominic sat in the chair by the window in Eleanor's old room and looked at the pendant she had taken with her. The room smelled of the herbal soap Mrs. Holt used. It was cold without the fire. Nothing had changed in the room. Everything had changed in the room. Outside the window, London went on without him. He thought about a locked south wing. He thought about a key. He did not move for a long time. Martha arrived at Greywood Hall steps on a Tuesday morning in a hired coach that had seen better years, carrying a case so worn the clasps had been replaced twice. She was 53 years old and looked like someone who had been walking toward this moment for over a year and had not been entirely certain she would reach it. Norris opened the door before she had finished climbing the steps. "I am looking for the household of the Duke of Windermere," Martha said, with the controlled steadiness of someone who has rehearsed what they would say. "I am looking for a young woman who may have arrived here some months ago. Fair hair, green eyes. She would not have known her own name." Norris looked at her for 3 seconds. "If you would come inside," he said, "I will fetch Lady Eugenia." Lady Eugenia arrived in the drawing-room with her walking stick and her violet coat, and her expression of a woman who had been expecting precisely this, or at least who had never entirely stopped expecting it. She sat. Martha sat. They looked at each other with the attention of two people conducting a rapid mutual assessment. "Tell me everything," Lady Eugenia said. "From the beginning," Martha told her. Oscar Ashford, the 14th Earl of Ashford, had been investigating French military intelligence networks still active in England after the wars, networks that had not dissolved with Napoleon's defeat, but had simply gone quiet and found new patrons. He and Lord Henry Ashworth had been working together on it, informally, for 2 years. In the autumn of 1807, someone had decided to stop them. The carriage accident was arranged. Both men died. Martha had been Eleanor's governess since infancy. Oscar Ashford came to her the week before his death and told her to take the child north under a different name, to say nothing to anyone, to keep her hidden until someone came for her with a key. He placed the pendant around Eleanor's neck himself. "Not yet," he told the child. "You will know when the time comes." Martha had taken Eleanor to Fenwick and spent 15 years waiting for someone to come. The fire had not been an accident. Lord Edmund Hartwell had arranged it. He had recognised Eleanor the previous autumn, during one of his visits to the north, and had sent men to deal with the complication quietly. Martha had been in the village when it started, and had run the wrong direction, and found herself in the next county by morning, with nothing but what was in her pockets. She had spent over a year making her way back south. She had never seen the body. Eleanor had been right about that. Norris sent a rider to London for Dominic. Eleanor had been at Hartwell House for 12 days. She had read the ledgers, all of them. She had done it quietly in the evenings, after the household settled, carrying a candle to the study Lord Edmund used during his London visits, and spending 2 hours each night with columns of figures that told a very clear story, if you understood what they were supposed to say, and could see where they diverged from what they actually said. 15 years of it, systematic, patient, complete. She had brought a small notebook. She had been copying specific entries, dates, signatures, account names, into it in her own hand. She had the notebook in her dress pocket when she came down to breakfast that morning. The gossip column was on the table. Lady Constance did not offer it to her. She simply set it there and sat opposite and waited. Eleanor picked it up and read it. The column named her. Miss Eleanor Vane, currently resident at Hartwell House, found unconscious at the Duke of Windermere's country gate, worked in his household in the capacity of a companion and assistant. Her American background, a fabrication. Her current social position, obtained by false representation. The column expressed its regrets about the deception of the Tun and named Lady Eugenia Pemberton as the architect of the scheme. Lady Constance said nothing. She waited. "You sourced this," Eleanor said. "I beg your pardon?" "You sourced this column." Eleanor set it down. "You know people who write these things. You have provided information to this particular column before, about other people, and been rewarded for it with the removal of inconvenient social competition. I know your methods, Lady Constance. I have spent 12 days in this house." Lady Constance smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had been cornered and was not concerned about it. "You are a young woman with no name and no papers and an invented American backstory," she said pleasantly. "Anything you say about my methods will be read in that context." Eleanor stood. Lord Edmund was in the corridor outside. She had not heard him arrive. He had the look of a man who had heard the last 30 seconds of a conversation through a door and had made a decision about it. "Eleanor," he said. He used her real name for the first time. She looked at him. "Come with me," he said. He had a pistol at his belt. He had a leather case in his hand. He said quietly, with the measured reasonableness that was his particular manner, "There are French agents who know exactly who you are and what your father left in that pendant. They have known since you arrived at Windermere's Gate. I have been the thing standing between you and them for 15 years. That position is no longer tenable. There is a ship. You will be safe in France. I give you my word." Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the pistol. She looked at the leather case. "I will not go," she said. Her voice was level. "Not willingly. Not to France. Not with you." Lord Edmund looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "I am sorry." The lock on the cabin door was heavy iron. Dominic arrived at Hartwell House at 3 o'clock to find the carriage gone, Lady Constance in the drawing-room, and Eleanor absent. Lady Constance said, without moving from her chair, that Miss Vane had chosen to leave, that the arrangements had been made at Miss Vane's request, that she was very sorry she could not be of more help. Dominic looked at her for one moment. Then he looked at the gossip column that was still on the breakfast table. Arthur appeared in the doorway. He was 12 years old and had the face of someone who had been awake since dawn and had been deciding something difficult. "The East India Docks," Arthur said. "The ship is called the Marguerite. My father has a manifest." Lady Constance made a sharp sound. Arthur looked at her. "She did not choose to go," he said. "I saw her face." He went back upstairs without another word. Dominic left. He was on horseback in less than 3 minutes. He sent word ahead to Guildford by a street runner. Guildford had contacts at the docks. He was halfway to the river when the answer came back. The Marguerite had moved from the berth 20 minutes ago. She was working toward the channel. He rode to the dock stairs. Norris was there. He was standing at the dock stairs with a hired rowboat and 2 oars and an expression of absolute professional neutrality, as though he had simply happened to find himself here on a Tuesday afternoon with a rowing boat and saw no reason to remark upon it. Dominic looked at him. "I came directly from Greywood Hall when the rider arrived," Norris said. "I took a coach and then a hired horse. I knew you would need the boat." A pause. "I may have been somewhat certain you would not think of a boat in the urgency of the moment." "Get in," Dominic said. They rowed. The cabin was below the waterline. It was dark except for a strip of grey coming through the gap at the doorframe, and it smelled of rope and bilge and the particular damp of a ship that had been working the channel for years. Eleanor had been in it for 3 hours. She was not crying. She had thought about it and decided against it on the grounds that it would not help, which was the calculation she made about most things. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, the pendant in both hands, thinking. The pendant had a key in it. The key opened a vault in a study inside a locked south wing of a country house in Windermere. The vault had letters in it. The letters would say what had happened. She knew this the way she knew the drainage figures were wrong, not because someone had told her, but because she had looked at what was available and followed it to its conclusion. She needed to get out of this cabin. She heard footsteps on the deck above her, then other footsteps, heavier, more than one person, the kind of footsteps that are not the crew. Something scraped against the hull, voices she did not recognize, and then a voice she did. The lock disengaged, the door opened. Dominic was there. Norris was directly behind him with something in his hand that had been taken from the purser's board, and was not officially a key but served the same function. Eleanor stood up. They looked at each other. From above came the sounds of people moving. At least 2 of them. The Marguerite's crew were somewhere else or had been persuaded elsewhere. A voice above them, sharp, accented, French, gave an instruction Eleanor could not make out through the hull. Dominic closed the door behind him. They were alone in the dark. He spoke quietly. Not a whisper, quieter than that. The kind of voice used when the wrong person hearing is a serious problem. "My father was murdered," he said. He said it the way you say something you have been carrying alone for 15 years, not announcing it, but finally setting it down. He did not look away from her. The carriage accident on the London road in the autumn of 1807. It was arranged. A Bow Street runner came to me 6 days after the funeral, with evidence a 17-year-old boy could not present to anyone with authority. The men who could have helped me were either part of it or afraid of it. I spent 15 years paying for information that went nowhere. He paused. I closed the south wing because my father's study was in it, and I could not go back in there without going back to that night. I have been living inside that night for 15 years, and I have not told another living person, because the alternative was becoming the kind of man who is consumed by it, and there were days when I was not certain I had not become him anyway. The hull groaned around them. Above them, the French voice again. Eleanor looked at him in the dark. She could barely see his face. She looked anyway. He knew, she said. My father. He came to Martha the week before the accident and put the pendant around my neck and told her to take me north. He said not yet, that I would know when the time came. She held up the pendant. The chain caught the grey light from the doorframe. He put your father's key inside the pendant, she said. He did not trust anyone alive to carry it safely. He gave it to a 5-year-old girl and sent her to the edge of the country because a 5-year-old girl was the safest place in England to hide a key. She looked at him. He knew what was coming, and he could not stop it, but he could make sure it did not end with them. He put the answer in your father's key. Dominic was very still. Whatever is in that vault, Eleanor said, I know how to read it. I have been reading the Hartwell ledgers for 12 days. I have a notebook in my pocket with enough to put Lord Edmund before a magistrate. Give me access to those letters, and I can show you what your father could not. He looked at her for a long moment. Above them, a shout, running footsteps, the sound of something heavy striking the deck. The vault, Dominic said. The key is in the pendant. The vault is in the study behind the south wing door. Then we need to get to Greywood Hall, Eleanor said. He took her hand. It was not gentle, and it was not romantic. It was the grip of two people who have decided to go in the same direction and are not going to waste time about it. She held it. The south wing, she said. After. After, he said. They went above deck together. Lord Edmund was at the rail. He had Pierre, the agent, the one who had apparently arranged the deaths of 2 men 15 years ago and had spent the intervening time in a variety of useful positions, in a conversation that had the quality of a confrontation barely contained. They were the same height. They were both the kind of men who did not raise their voices. Dominic and Eleanor came up from below deck. Lord Edmund registered Dominic's presence in one glance, and something passed across his face that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but was close enough to both that Eleanor understood it. He had been calculating this for a long time. She saw that now. He said to Pierre, "The arrangement ends here." Pierre said something in French, short, final. Lord Edmund shot him. He turned immediately to Eleanor. "Run," he said. His voice was very calm. "Get off this ship. Take her off this ship." To Dominic, and then to the remaining agent who was on the far side of the deck. "You will have to come through me." Eleanor ran. Dominic had her arm. They reached the rail. Norris was in the rowboat below. The ladder was rope, and Eleanor did not look down and did not look back. She heard a shot. She kept moving. She reached the rowboat. She sat down. Dominic was behind her. Norris was already rowing. The Marguerite receded in the grey water. Lord Edmund did not come down the ladder. Eleanor sat in the rowboat with the pendant in her hands and the notebook in her pocket, and the sound of the shot still in her ears. She did not cry. She looked at the ship getting smaller and thought about a man who had been many things, most of them wrong. He had spent 15 years carrying the weight of what he had agreed to, and at the end he had put himself between something monstrous and the only family he had left. It did not undo what he had done. She knew that. She thought he had known it too. The river was grey and wide, and London was behind them, and she was alive. She held the pendant. She did not look back. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Greywood Hall, and the vault opened at last with the pendant key, and the letters inside it spread across the study table by lamplight, while Eleanor and Dominic read them in silence, each one more damning than the last. 3 weeks of her notebook alongside Lord Henry Ashworth's own hand, the 2 sets of evidence converging to the same point. 3 weeks of Dominic's solicitor in the library, and the magistrate's man who came quietly on a Friday, and left quietly with copies of everything. 3 weeks of Lady Eugenia managing the social landscape from a distance and saying, each time Eleanor asked about the gossip column, Not yet. We will do this correctly. Eleanor had recovered. She had slept. She had opened the south wing study herself with the pendant key and stood in it for a long time. There was a portrait of Lord Henry Ashworth in that study. She looked at it and thought about a carriage on a London road in the autumn of 1807, about what it cost a 17-year-old boy to carry that knowledge alone for 15 years. She understood something then about the east corridor and the locked door and the particular quality of Dominic's stillness. She had closed the study door behind her when she left. Not locked, closed. Cecily had come to Greywood Hall 10 days ago and had not left, partly from loyalty, partly because Lord Hadley had followed from his estate with the expression of a man who had finally decided something. Both of them were currently in a state of suspended resolution that Lady Eugenia found gratifying, but far too slow. It was Cecily who arranged Eleanor's hair on the evening of the Almack's assembly. It was Cecily who said, "Wear the pendant, no borrowed jewellery, your own." Eleanor wore the pendant. She entered Almack's on Cecily's arm. The rooms were full, the height of the season, chandeliers blazing, the orchestra playing something fashionable from behind their gallery screen, the floor already turning with dancers. Eleanor felt the room register her entrance the way a room registers anything it has already decided about. Heads turned. The murmur that preceded her through the crowd had the particular texture of a decision already made. Lady Seaton was near the door. She was the sort of Almack's patroness who had built her social authority entirely on the quality of her disapproval, and she deployed it now with the efficiency of long practice. She turned her back, completely. Before Eleanor had taken 4 steps into the room, the people nearest Lady Seaton saw it. Eleanor took 4 more steps. At the back of the room, near the south window, Lady Eugenia stood with a glass of negus, and the expression of a woman attending a planned event. She did not look at Eleanor. She looked at the middle distance with the serenity of someone who had already read the last chapter. "Do you know," she remarked to the dowager beside her, "I've always found that the most revealing moment of an assembly is not who dances with whom, but who turns their back. It tells you everything about a person's confidence in their own position." The dowager looked at her. "The less secure the position," Lady Eugenia said, "the more dramatic the turn." She sipped her negus. On the far side of the room, Dominic stood at the edge of the south arcade, not beside Eleanor, not moving toward her. He was still. He was watching. The solicitor was near the east door, which was not an accidental arrangement, and in the centre of the room Lady Arabella Fairfax stood in deep blue, composed and beautiful, and she had been waiting for this. Lady Arabella moved through the room the way she always moved, with the unhurried certainty of a woman who believed the room organised itself around her, which it generally had. She positioned herself in Eleanor's path, near the centre of the floor. The dancers parted around her without instruction. The nearest conversations went quieter. She stood and waited. Eleanor stopped. They were 3 feet apart, the distance between a question and its answer. Lady Arabella did not raise her voice. She never needed to. Her voice was the kind that carried without effort when the room went still enough, and this room was going still. "Miss Vane," she said. "Or, I beg your pardon. I understand there has been some uncertainty about the name." The nearest dancers had stopped. The music played on from the gallery, but the floor immediately around them had gone quiet. "I think we should stop pretending," Lady Arabella said, "for everyone's sake." She addressed the room generally, which was the technique, not attacking Eleanor personally, but performing a social service, setting the record straight, reluctantly. This young woman was found on a country road by the Duke of Windermere's household, taken in as an act of charity, and subsequently presented to society under a false name and a false history, with the support of Lady Eugenia Pemberton. The American story is a fabrication. The Vane family is a fabrication. She is nobody. A pause. She was always nobody. She came from nothing, and she has built nothing, and the only remarkable thing she has done is convince one of the most respected households in England to deceive the Ton on her behalf. The musicians in the gallery played on for 2 bars and then stopped. Someone had sent word, or they had felt the room change. Silence. Complete, absolute, the kind that only Almack's could produce, every person in the room holding still as the last note faded. Eleanor stood at the centre of it. She was not shaking. Her hands were perfectly still. She had been shaking at 2 in the morning when Cecily had heard her through the wall and come in and sat beside her without asking, and Eleanor had cried then in private, which she had required. She was not doing that now. She held Lady Arabella's gaze. She did not look for Dominic. She did not look for Lady Eugenia. She waited for exactly the right number of seconds. Then she nodded toward the east door. Toward Norris. Norris came through the crowd with the ledger books. There were 3 of them, bound in brown leather, marked with tabs. He had been holding them at the east entrance for the better part of an hour. He brought them to Eleanor at the centre of the floor and handed them to her with the formality of someone presenting a document at a proceeding. Eleanor set the first one on the nearest empty table, a card table, brought to the edge of the floor, as though it had been placed there for this exact purpose, which it had, and opened it. "These," she said, "are the account books of the Ashford estate. They cover 15 years of management by Lord Edmund Hartwell, the Earl of Hartwell, as executor following the death of Oscar Ashford, the 14th Earl of Ashford, in the autumn of 1807. The room was completely still. Eleanor opened to the first tab. She read aloud. She read a specific entry, a date, a category of expenditure, a sum, and a name. She read the second entry. She read the third. Each one was dated, specific, signed. Each one described funds withdrawn from the Ashford estate under categories that did not correspond to any actual work performed, confirmed by the absence of corresponding labour records, vendor receipts, or yield improvements in the accounts that followed. She read without drama. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. 15 years of theft, read aloud in a ballroom, in plain figures. "There are 143 entries of this type across these 3 volumes," she said. "I have examined each one. I have cross-referenced them against the corresponding estate records, which are held by the estate steward and have been submitted to the Crown Magistrate's office. Each discrepancy is documented." She looked up. "Lord Edmund Hartwell managed the Ashford estate as though it were his own," she said. "It was not his. It was mine." She put down the ledger. She looked at Lady Arabella. "You told this room I am nobody," she said. "You told them I was always nobody, that I came from nothing." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You were wrong on every count. I am Lady Marian Ashford, daughter of Oscar Ashford, 14th Earl of Ashford, and the Ashford estate has been stolen from me for 15 years by a man who is now dead, and I have the proof of it in my hands, and I am nobody's fraud. I never was." Lady Arabella went still. The colour left her face, not slowly, completely, all at once, the way colour leaves when the body decides it has more important things to do than keep the face composed. Her hand found her fan. She held it. The ivory stave bent. The room went completely silent. And then it did not. The murmur broke like water over a dam, not loud, not a single exclamation, but 100 small ones, the crowd turning physically toward Eleanor in the same motion, the nearest people leaning in, the ones farther away pressing forward on tiptoe. The musicians in the gallery began a low consultation. Lady Seaton, near the south door, received the information from the woman beside her and turned from one direction to another with the expression of someone whose certainty has just become a liability. The solicitor stepped forward from the east door. His name was Mr. Pearsall. He was Dominic's solicitor, and he had been retained by the Ashworth household for 12 years, and he had spent the past 2 weeks preparing for approximately 8 minutes of work. He cleared his throat. He read from the first letter. Lord Henry Ashworth's handwriting, the letter addressed to Oscar Ashford, bearing the Ashworth seal, dated the 15th of October, 1807. The letter described the nature of the intelligence networks they had been investigating. French military intelligence sold through intermediaries to remnant Bonapartist interests, still active in England 3 years after the Treaty of Paris. The letter named the agent who had provided the killers access to their carriage route. The letter named Lord Edmund Hartwell. The room absorbed this. Mr. Pearsall read from the second letter. Oscar Ashford's hand, addressed to Lord Henry Ashworth describing his arrangement for his daughter's protection. The pendant, the key, the instructions to the governess, the sentence that stated plainly, "I am placing this in Marian's keeping, because she is the only soul in England who cannot be reached, threatened, or persuaded. She will come back when it is safe. She will know what to open. He read the final declaration from the letter, his daughter's legal name, her birth date, her seal as Lady Marian Ashford, daughter of the 14th Earl of Ashford. "The letters bear Lord Henry Ashworth's seal," Mr. Pearsall said, "which is known to any member of this assembly who was acquainted with him." He looked up. "Lady Marian Ashford, daughter of the late 14th Earl of Ashford, is present in this room." Lady Constance Hartwell was at the far edge of the crowd near the east door. She had been named in the letters by association. The letter had described Lord Edmund's household as complicit in the cover-up of Eleanor's identity and the continued management of the estate. The people nearest her stepped back, not dramatically, quietly, as though they had noticed something and adjusted accordingly. She did not flee. She was not the kind of woman who fled, but she could not stay either, and she knew it, and so did everyone near her. She walked to the east door with her chin level and her hands still and the eyes of 20 people on her back, and she left. Cecily, who had been watching from the edge of the floor with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this since the morning Lady Arabella spoke across Eleanor in the Greywood Hall drawing-room, said something quiet and thoroughly inelegant under her breath. Lady Eugenia, who was nearby, chose not to hear it. Dominic walked from the edge of the room. He did not walk quickly, and he did not run. He crossed the floor of Almack's with the particular quality of motion he had when he had decided something completely and was simply closing the distance. The crowd did not part exactly. They moved, the way a crowd moves when it understands what is about to happen and wants to be present for it. He reached Eleanor. He took her hand, in front of every person in that room, in front of Lady Seaton, and the assembled ton and the musicians in the gallery, and the patronesses in their chairs, and the people who had turned their backs, and the people who had leaned forward, and all of it. He took her hand, and it was not ambiguous, and it was not for the room. It simply was. Then he turned to the room. "This woman is Lady Marian Ashford," he said. His voice was the voice he used when he wanted something to be heard, without any possibility of later doubt. "She is the daughter of the 14th Earl of Ashford. She is my betrothed. She is the Duchess of Windermere." He paused. One beat. "And she is the finest person in this room." The assembly stirred. Those who had given the cut direct were now visibly reconsidering the math. Those who had pressed forward to hear the ledgers were now pressing forward to see this. Lady Eugenia, at the back of the room, had an expression that could only be described as the exact expression of a woman whose plan has arrived at its intended destination on schedule. Cecily took Eleanor's other arm. Eleanor stood between them, between Cecily's warmth and Dominic's certainty, and the crowd was on her side now, completely, audibly finally. She had worn the pendant for this room. It had always been meant for this room. Lady Arabella Fairfax left the ball before the orchestra resumed. She walked to the south exit with the composure of a woman who would not run and would not hurry. The room did not watch her go with cruelty. It simply did not watch her go at all. It had turned to Eleanor. Lady Arabella's single backward glance at the door found no one returning it. Not a single face. The room had found a more interesting direction. She left. She would leave London before the season ended. Her connection to the Hartwell family, well known in certain social circles, useful until this evening, was now a liability that could not be explained away over the course of a season. She understood this with the same precision that had made her socially formidable, and she did not make the mistake of staying where she was no longer welcome. Lady Constance Hartwell was met at Hartwell House by a representative of the magistrate's office, sent by Wellington's own arrangement at Dominic's request 2 days prior. She was informed that the Ashford estate accounts were under Crown review pending investigation of the late Lord Edmund Hartwell's management. She was further informed that the Crown's review would include the Hartwell House property, and that she would be required to vacate within 40 days pending the completion of the financial accounting. She received this information with the composure she had maintained all evening. She would go to her sister's house in Bath. She would not come back. Arthur Hartwell was at school. He would stay there. He would visit at Christmas and Easter, as arranged. Eleanor stood in the centre of Almack's with Cecily on one arm and Dominic's hand in hers, and the crowd on her side, and she felt something she had not felt since before she could remember feeling anything. She was in the right place. She was the right person. She was exactly who she was supposed to be. The ballroom had erupted in conversation around them. She heard none of it. She was looking at him. The chapel at Greywood Hall was small. It held perhaps 40 people comfortably, and had been built by the second Duke with exactly that in mind, because he had found large gatherings inconvenient. The light came through a plain east window in the morning, and fell across the stone floor in a wide rectangle that moved as the sun moved. Eleanor stood in it. She wore a dress she had chosen herself, cream silk with a high waist and long sleeves and no borrowed ornament. She wore the pendant, no other jewellery. The pendant was warm at her throat. She had put it on that morning without Lady Eugenia's counsel or Nell's opinion or anyone else's. It was hers. It had always been hers. Today, of all days, it went where she went. Martha held her gloves. Martha had been at Greywood Hall since the week after the Almack's assembly, and she had the look of a woman who had put something down after carrying it for 15 years. She was not crying. Neither was Eleanor. Lady Eugenia was in the front pew in violet. She had been in the front pew of more events than she could count, and she had opinions about all of them, and this one she kept to herself, which was unusual. She looked at Eleanor standing in the morning light in the chapel doorway and said, in the quietest tone she had used in as long as Eleanor had known her, "Your father would have found the groom acceptable. Eventually?" Eleanor almost smiled. He would have interviewed him for 3 hours, Lady Eugenia added, and found him somewhat shorter on conversation than ideal, but fundamentally sound. She opened her prayer book. "I am told that is precisely what happens when you have the same conversation with yourself for 15 years instead of with other people." Cecily, who was sitting beside her and had recently settled her own situation with Lord Hadley, he had finally declared in the Greywood Hall garden after a conversation Cecily described as entirely satisfying and long overdue, said something that made Lady Eugenia produce the small, precise sound again. Dominic was waiting at the altar. He was not wearing his cold mask. He had not worn it since the ship, or perhaps since before the ship. Eleanor thought she could identify the exact moment it had stopped fitting, somewhere in an east corridor, in front of a portrait, in the dark of a late night. He looked at her when she came down the aisle. He did not look away. The ceremony was short. The vicar had been given his instructions. When Eleanor said her name, her real name, Lady Marian Ashford, which she had been practising since Bond Street, Martha's expression changed entirely, just for a moment, just enough for Eleanor to see it. Then Martha pressed her gloves and her expression settled back to practical. Norris, as witness, signed with his usual precision. Nell cried quietly behind her hand, which she would later deny. Outside the chapel door, the Greywood Hall garden was still and bright in the September morning, and the gate at the end of the gravel path was the same gate it had always been, and the gravel was dry. She found him in the garden before the household was fully awake. He was on the bench by the far wall, the bench that looked back toward the house, toward the east windows, toward the corridor she knew led past the portrait, and along to the south wing study with its unsealed vault and its open door. He had brought tea. There were 2 cups, which meant he had known she would come. She sat beside him. They did not need to say anything for a while. The morning was clear and cool, with the smell of the garden still green before autumn took it, the light on the east facade of Greywood Hall soft and low. "The south wing," Dominic said. "I will open it properly. Not just the study. All of it." Eleanor curled her hands around her cup. "I have been meaning to for 15 years, he said. "I should not have closed it in the first place. It was the only thing I could control, and I made it mean more than it should have." "It meant exactly what it should have," she said. "You were 17. He looked at his cup. "I want to see the rooms," she said. "I want to know what is in them." "Most of the furniture is under Holland covers," he said. "The proportions are good. My mother had it done with rose-coloured curtains, which I have always found objectionable, but I am told one does not remark on such things." Eleanor considered this. "I find rose-coloured curtains perfectly acceptable," she said. "Then we are immediately at an impasse," he said. "On our first morning." "It is not our first morning." "On our first official morning." She looked at him. He was almost smiling. She still found it slightly arresting, the same quality as the almost laugh, which she had never quite got used to even after months. She thought she would probably spend the rest of her life being slightly arrested by it, and found she had no objection to this. He reached out and covered her hand on the bench between them. The garden was warm and still. The pendant lay against her collarbone. The the gold bright in the morning sun. Somewhere inside the household was beginning to wake. The day was starting. There was nothing coming that she needed to be afraid of. 3 years later, the south wing was open. The rose-coloured curtains were gone. There had been a brief marital discussion on the subject that Eleanor had won by the simple expedient of pointing out the curtains were faded, which was inarguably true. The rooms were used now, the nursery at the end of the corridor, the sitting room that got the best morning light, the study where Lord Henry Ashworth's portrait had been moved from the east corridor to hang above the fireplace where it belonged. Lord Henry Ashworth had dark hair and grey eyes, and the particular jaw that Eleanor's son had apparently inherited directly, missing a generation entirely, which Eleanor found quietly satisfying. Henry was 2 years old. He had his grandmother's green eyes and his grandfather's jaw, and the opinion of a child who had been told no and had found this information very difficult to accept. He was currently in the garden with an intensity of purpose that generally indicated he had found something interesting and was investigating it. Arthur Hartwell was home from school for the summer. He was 15 now and had grown into the kind of young man who had good instincts he was still learning to trust, which Eleanor thought was about the right pace for 15. He was teaching Henry to recognize birds by their calls, which Henry found absorbing for approximately 3 minutes before discovering a beetle, which Arthur found more interesting than he would admit. Cecily arrived at 2 in the afternoon with Lord Hadley and their 2 children, and the energy she always brought, the energy of someone who had been in motion since breakfast and had no particular use for rest. She kissed Eleanor on both cheeks and looked at her with the particular look of a woman who has been waiting to say something. "You are expecting," Cecily said. "It is possible," Eleanor said. "It is visible," Cecily said. "You are terrible at keeping things. Secrets, I mean. You are excellent at keeping ledgers." Lord Hadley, who had learned over the past 3 years that the friendship between his wife and the Duchess of Windermere moved faster than he could follow, went to find Dominic, which was where he generally went when this happened. Lady Eugenia's portrait was on the south staircase. She had died the previous winter, peacefully, in the violet room of her London house with Norris at the door and a glass of good port on the table beside her. She had left Greywood Hall a letter that Eleanor kept in the desk drawer and did not show anyone. It was hers. It said exactly what it was supposed to say. Her portrait on the staircase had the expression she wore when she was about to say something that would land at the end of a perfectly ordinary sentence. Eleanor passed it every morning and every evening and found that this was exactly the right expression for a staircase. The vault in the south wing study was sealed. The pendant key hung on Eleanor's watch chain. Not evidence anymore. Jewellery. The pendant was at her throat in the portrait hanging in the dining room. She wore the same dress she had worn at Almack's. The pendant caught the light the same way it had caught it in the Almack's chandeliers, and in Mrs. Holt's anteroom on the first night, and in Eleanor's fist in the rain at Greywood Hall's iron gates. It had come home too. Dominic found her in the garden at the end of the afternoon, when the light was going gold and long across the grass, and Henry had fallen asleep in the house under Arthur's eye. She was sitting on the bench by the far wall. The same bench. The morning light had been here this morning. It was evening light now, lower and warmer. He sat beside her, and she took his hand without looking, because she did not need to look. The gate at the end of the gravel path was the same iron gate it had always been. The gravel beyond it was dry. The road beyond the gate was quiet. She had arrived at that gate with nothing, no name, no claim. The pendant cutting into her palm and the rain on her face, and worth nothing to anyone in that moment, not even to herself. She was the Duchess of Windermere. She was Lady Marian Ashford, daughter of Oscar Ashford, and his green-eyed wife, the woman in the portrait. She was Eleanor, which was the name she had given herself in a borrowed dress with her heart in her throat. She was Dominic's wife, and Henry's mother, and Cecily's dearest friend, and Arthur's improbable safe harbour, and Lady Eugenia's best project. She had arrived with nothing but a pendant and a name she could not yet claim. She did not need to finish the thought. There was nothing left to say about what she once was. She was home.